Welcome to the UN and Organised Crime, a podcast series from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Tennant. This episode takes place as UN member states continue on the preparatory process for the 15th UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which takes place in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates in April 2026. The Crime Congress is the biggest gathering of officials, experts and organisations which focuses on crime and justice. It takes place every 5 years. The last Congress took place in Kyoto, Japan in 2021, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. This means it took place 1 year later than it should have done, and with tight restrictions on who could attend in person. This means that the next UN Crime Congress will be the first opportunity to get together in person at its intended scale for 11 years. The Congress has a long history, being born out of a series of meetings that predate the United Nations itself, and they have a unique role for independent experts and civil society. In fact, the Congress is mandated to act as a platform for exchange between different sectors. It's not just another intergovernmental meeting. Despite this, as across many other parts of the UN, it still remains a challenge to ensure meaningful participation. At the 34th CCPCJ in May, 3 Resilience Fund grantees came together for a memorable side event where they presented their community work supporting the launch of a Resilience Fund policy brief on the role of civil society, which was presented as an official global initiative submission to the CCPCJ, which was the last session of the CCPCJ until the Crime Congress next year. The 3 grantees in question also worked together to deliver a statement in the plenary of the meeting. In this episode, those 3 brave civil society activists who attended the CCPCJ, Romandash from Ukraine, Noor Azizha from Myanmar, and Lucie Andrea Gutiérrez from Colombia, will reflect on their experiences, telling their stories, what they have learned from each other, and the engagements that they had, and what messages they have for delegates in Vienna who will now start negotiating the outcome document of the next Crime Congress. So I will start with Anna, if I may. Anna, you joined us here in Vienna in May. What did you learn from your experiences at the CCPCJ, both from your fellow Resilience Fund grantees, but also from delegates and other partners that you met?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for this question. I think the experience in Vienna was extremely important and relevant because it gave me a better understanding on how to advocate for Ukraine, for human rights, for the protections of victims of human trafficking, of organized crime. I got to see a little bit better how people in this really complex UN system are operating and what kind of language works best to explain what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and in other fragile contexts. I think what I've learned from this experience was that there are a lot of actors, NGO organizations, civil society, individuals even, but also entities, agencies within different governments and diplomatic missions that are genuinely interested in helping countries like Ukraine and actors within Ukraine to fight for better human rights protection, to fight against organized crime. But there's not always this working link between practitioners on the ground and the policymakers in Vienna or elsewhere. So this is something that I've learned, that it's extremely important to be building those bridges and to be connecting people working on the ground and people who are working on policy, who are working on international advocacy, outreach, and so on.
Thank you, Anna, for your perspectives, and thank you for the perspectives that you brought to our events and engagements in Vienna. I think from a conflict zone and the specific organized crime challenges that you're facing were particularly relevant and important. I'll ask Lucie now, who came over from Colombia, to answer the same question. So what did you learn from your experiences at the CCPCJ, Lucie?
Thank you, Ian, and I'm very grateful for having us once more. And most importantly, I'm truly glad to be here again with Anna and Noor, who remind me that What I took from this experience, as with my journey in Pásame el Balón, as Anna was saying, is the power of human connections. Both in Vienna and in the communities where we work, I've learned that trust and empathy are the strongest tools we have. From my colleagues who inspire me with practical ideas and motivation, through the children and families I work with, remind me every day that resilience is built through relationships. And that is the lesson that I carry, that people themselves, when supported and recognized, become the most powerful agents of prevention. And for example, from Colombia, I connected with another GI-TOC fellow, Luisa, and she's working with Afro-Colombian children in the Pacific region. And she inspired me with practical ideas, such as photography initiative that helps young people envision themselves as filmmakers and writers or photographers. And these exchanges show us new ways to give youth real tools and effective methods that inspire them. By connecting them with their own role models, together we help them dream and find purposes and choose meaningful alternatives to organized crime. And at the same time, we strengthen the social fabric of their communities, build on genuine relationships, creativity, and networks of trust and motivation, like the one I felt while participating at the CCPCJ event.
Thank you, Lucie. And I think you and Anna have both made very important points about the importance of human connections and practitioners meet each other and understanding what's really going on. I think for a lot of us who are attending these UN meetings regularly, it sometimes feels like the issues you're discussing are a little bit abstract or far away from what's really going on in communities in real life. And that's why it's so important for us at the Global Initiative to make sure the real stories are being heard. Noor, you gave a very emotive presentation in an event that we worked on together in Vienna. And I think, you really brought home the power of stories and real impacts on people. So, I mean, for somebody like you and the experience you've had working with persecuted Rohingya community and risks of human trafficking, what did you learn from the experiences that you had in Vienna?
I learned that many refugees do not actually have this space that was provided to me. I have the lived experience as a refugee and, mass displacement and the outcomes of what my people still have to go through. But beyond that, what I also learned is that Anna and Lucie and I, as grantees and as people working in organized crimes, we all have similar goals. We want impunity to not exist. We want people to know what's happening on the ground and how it's affecting the most vulnerable populations. Anna spoke to me about how she helped a Ukrainian woman come back to Ukraine as she was kidnapped by the Russian government. And I thought that was really inspiring. And I felt really touched by the human stories. We can talk about policy, we can talk about UN talk, but for me, what was really meaningful for me is learning from Lucie and Anna and really listening to them and bringing back the knowledge that they have to my work. So I got to visit the Rohingya refugee camp this week in Indonesia, and I want to make sure that I can bring back the voices of my people in areas like the United Nations.
Thank you, Noor. And of course, the reason you want to bring those voices to the United Nations is to have impact on policy and to try and make change through the work that we're doing. So when it comes to international meetings like the CCPCJ, I'm going to go back to Lucie now. As somebody who's dedicated your life to supporting communities and young people at the local level, what do you hope to achieve by coming to the UN and bridging that gap between the local and the global?
For me, it is important because these spaces provide visibility, not only to highlight community potential, but also, in the case of Pásame el Balón, to advocate and demonstrate the value of supporting community process through armed civilian protection strategies, while acknowledging the daily challenges communities face in their resistance. International meetings create opportunities to bridge local realities with global debates, and to advocate for moving away from top-down approaches toward genuine recognition of communities as true decision makers in shaping solutions. So at Paso el Balón, we have learned about the power of support networks, the ones we have helped strengthen within communities, the ones we have built together with them, and those we have created with other actors that will allow us to grow stronger collectively. So, in our experience, these networks are potential truth bridges connecting empirical knowledge with life experience and amplified initiatives deeply rooted in the territories. And they are genuine, spontaneous, and empathetic connections of civilians protecting civilians that suffer forced displacement, confinement, exclusion, racism, and that connections expanding the sense of community. Because for us, going to Chimbusa or Brisas, where we work, is to feel the true sense of community. And that is the same spirit we have cultivated within the team of Paso el Balón. We have learned this directly from years of working alongside communities with a strong sense of solidarity. And it is precisely that deep sense of community that sustains their resilience. So, through nonviolent methods such as football, education, music, tradition, and so on, young people emerge as positive role models, showing us how resilience is built by nurturing empathy, care, and respect for one another, as well as bringing tools that promote critical thinking, emotional regulation, conflict resolution, and more. All of these in the face of violence. And this is why it is essential that these life experiences are what must be brought to the international stage.
Thank you, Lucie. And we really hope that delegates take on board everything that you've shown. And then going back to Anna, you're an investigative journalist in a war-afflicted country due to the Russian war of aggression. Do you think the international community understands what it's like for journalists like you on the front line trying to report on organized crime? And what do you think the UN Crime Congress could say to better recognize your situation?
Well, I don't think there's a clear understanding of what it's like to live and work in Ukraine and to investigate or work on issues related to organized crime. I think there's generally a limited understanding of what Ukraine looks like now or how the civil society and active citizens are operating. I think when we think of conflict or fragile environments or fragile communities, we generally tend to think in extremes. It's either a community that is almost starving or starving, and it's impossible to do any projects or activities to sustain the communities, to help them become more resilient on their own. Or we think with another extreme that the communities are working just fine and they don't really need external help. But somewhat the truth or the reality is somewhat in the middle, whether it's Ukraine or many other communities. There are issues, a lot of international, but also domestic issues that are provoked or worsened by the organized crime, by the conflict, by the overall fragility of the domestic situation. But the communities are also really active. They are working and fighting and protecting human rights and are working to identify organized crime actors and to protect the integrity, the safety of the people, of the vulnerable populations that may be affected by these organized crime groups. And I think when it comes to Ukraine, it's extremely important to, first of all, have the voices of Ukrainians heard, give them a seat at the table, not rely just on some shallow headlines, but actually listen to the people who are working on the issues related to organized crime, related to corruption, related to human rights, trauma, reconciliation, supporting survivors. That's the first thing. And second of all, to operate with more of a nuanced understanding of what it's like to work and operate in a conflict, not to think in terms of this is either a terrible, hopeless situation or the opposite. We don't really need to help because I got it. But rather, be flexible, be willing to help when help is needed, but also by lifting and involving local voices, local actors. So this fight against organized crime, the support for victims, for survivors, for people affected feels like a co-creation where the local communities are engaged and where they have a say on how things should be addressed and resolved.
Thank you, Anna, for being very concrete in your recommendations there. And I will go to Noor to ask the same. Your presentations that you've made here in Vienna, Noor, were, as I said, very emotive, with tragic, but also inspiring stories. But why is it important for you to tell those stories? And what do you want the international community to do in response?
Yeah, I think it's important to know that the Rohingya crisis is ongoing and it has not stopped. Some people might think the displacement of Rohingya stopped in 2017, but in the last year and a half alone, more than 120,000 Rohingya refugees fled the violence in Rakhine State in Myanmar and have headed towards Bangladesh. And now they're living in the largest refugee camp in the world in Bangladesh, hosting more than 1.2 million Rohingya refugees. I got to visit the camp 2 months ago, and because of the global humanitarian funding cuts, the situation is extremely dire. 6,500 learning centers have shut. There are more than 500,000 Rohingya children living in the camp with zero access to education. When my vehicle entered the refugee camp, there were children everywhere. And I was very afraid about the children being hurt by the vehicle. And it's because they have absolutely nothing to do. And when I spoke to my people and the parents, they yearn for education for their children because at the end of the day, we do want to go back home when it's safe to do so. So what I'd like the international community to know is that this crisis is ongoing. We are the most persecuted ethnic minority in the world, according to the United Nations. Unfortunately, the world has failed the Rohingya. There are more than 90% of Rohingya outside of our ancestral homeland. And I think this underscores the severity of the crisis and how we've been pushed to the brink of survival. There are 3 million Rohingya refugees worldwide, and out of the 3 million, only 1% of the 3 million live in freedom. And I'm part of that 1%, which is a very small number of the people that can live with freedom and carry a passport. And again, we are the largest stateless community in the world because the military junta rendered us stateless in 1982, which was part of their violence. And this highlights how important it is for Rohingya women advocates like myself to be involved at United Nations meetings and high-level meetings to bring back the voices of the most vulnerable and the most unheard.
Thank you for that, Noor. Final question now for everybody, and I'll start with Lucie, if that's okay. And very quickly, what's your message for delegates preparing for the next Crime Congress from you?
For me, like to coming to the UN to be able to speak at these events, to deliver a message to these high-level people, it's a way to show in an increasingly polarized world that resilience is no abstract. It is lived daily in local communities. It exists in children playing football instead of holding weapons, in sport leaders training kids, in parents teaching no violence through music and traditions, and in communities that persist with dignity despite adversity. So my message to delegates is this. If we want lasting solutions to organized crime, we must center communities as protagonists. They already have the resilience, creativity, and unmarketable determination and knowledge to resist violence with dignity. And what they need is for us, policymakers, practitioners, and international actors, is to truly recognize, support, and resource them. Yet barriers to direct funding and genuine inclusion persist, and there is a call for decolonization and greater decision-making power for communities. And only then we will build more inclusive and legitimate and sustainable responses towards a more effective approach to tackling transnational organized crime.
Thank you, Lucie. And I will ask the same question to Anna.
I would like to thank the fund for inviting us, myself, Lucie, and Noor, to be in Vienna, because I think it was such a special moment for us to be able to speak, to meet, to talk, and also to present our work to very broad international audiences. I think this is something that you don't get to do often enough, because very often the voices of civil society, of the actors working on the ground, they are not perceived as important, or they're not as valuable in international advocacy. And this kind of leads me to my main message, or the takeaway, that it's really important to have people like us present and speaking, young people, people with lived experiences of the communities that they are trying to serve, people who are organizing and uniting communities around them. For these people to be present, to be able to speak, and to be able to advocate, to talk about what actually matters, what hurts the communities on the ground, and to have this connection, to have this link. It was also a very important learning opportunity, I think, for all of us when we met in Vienna, because we were able to exchange ideas and learn about each other's experiences. And that's another thing. It's important to create these spaces for civil society to engage with policymakers, but also for civil society to engage with each other outside of certain regional or geographic boundaries. I think it's very important to have these platforms and bridges to talk, to engage, and to co-create. And I do hope that there's a possibility to speak, to share, to remind the world once again about the resilient communities and the support that they need in Ukraine, in Myanmar, in Colombia, all over the place, to speak about that in Abu Dhabi, in other places, on other platforms, because it is so very important and we don't get to talk about it enough.
Thank you, Anna, for that. Couldn't agree more. And the last word I will give to Noor.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the team for all their support in providing us a platform to speak about all the issues we feel very passionate about. Unfortunately, in this world, what we are seeing is crisis arising. And when crisis is occurring, organized crimes also increase. Human traffickers are preying on the vulnerability of refugees, of forced migration. And you can use the Rohingya issue as an example. When Rohingya are fleeing the violence in Myanmar, often women jump on a boat across the Andaman Sea with their children, carrying their children, looking for a better life, not for themselves, but for their very, very children. And they arrive in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in other neighboring countries without any protection. Most of the nations nearby Myanmar are not part of 1951 Refugee Convention. Therefore, Rohingya are living in extremely vulnerable positions. I was in exile in Malaysia for 8 years and a half when I fled Myanmar as a child. And I spent 90% of my life hiding in the jungles of Borneo in Sabah, Malaysia, afraid of being detained. I didn't have any access to schooling. I didn't have any access to medical support until I was resettled to Australia. But I knew my freedom was not complete when I arrived in Australia, because there are millions and millions of my people living in really harsh conditions, and that is just unfair, and we cannot accept that. So my message would be, you don't have to speak the UN language to tell people's stories. You don't have to know technicalities to tell the stories of people that are struggling. Be yourself, but always be genuine, because people can see it.
Well, thank you very much, Noor, for those words of inspiration and advice. Thank you to you, Anna and Lucie, for everything you're doing in the communities where you're working, and everything you're doing to bring those experiences, insights, and calls to action to the United Nations and to the member states of the United Nations. We at the Global Initiative will be working hard to make sure that delegates are listening to you and people like you, and standing up for those in vulnerable, in desperate, and in other unfavorable situations around the world, whose situations could be improved by a more effective response to organized crime. that we are calling for. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for listening to the UN and Organized Crime.